The sixth floor. Jake had always been a night owl. His new job as a security guard at Parkview Apartments seemed perfect: quiet nights, decent pay, and minimal interaction with people. The building was old, but the tenants were mostly young professionals or retirees who kept to themselves. It seemed like the perfect gig, until he started working the night shift. Parkview Apartments had 5 floors, each with long, dimly lit hallways and outdated decor. The elevator creaked whenever it moved, and the wind often howled through the cracked windows at night, but Jake figured it was all part of the charm. That was, until he noticed something strange during his 3rd week. It was around 3 a.m. when Jake heard the elevator ding. He glanced up from his security monitors and saw the elevator doors slide open. No one stepped out. Confused, Jake watched the screen, expecting to see someone come into view. The camera feed showed an empty hallway. He switched to the feed inside the elevator. The doors stood open, and no one was inside. After a minute, the doors closed, and the elevator returned to the lobby. Jake felt a chill creep down his spine, but he shook it off. Faulty wiring, he muttered to himself. The next night, the elevator did it again. This time, Jake noticed the digital floor indicator flicker, going from 1 to 2, then 3, 4, 5, and then 6. Parkview Apartments only had 5 floors. Jake stared at the screen, unblinking. The elevator had stopped at the 6th floor. But that was impossible. There was no 6th floor. The building plans clearly showed only 5 levels. He watched, mesmerized, as the elevator doors opened on this non-existent floor. The screen was filled with static for a moment, and then, something flickered into view, an empty hallway that seemed wrong. The walls were darker, almost decayed. The lights were flickering, casting long shadows that danced unnaturally. Jake could feel his heartbeat quicken as he squinted at the screen. Then, something moved. A dark figure stepped into view, tall and thin, with unnaturally long limbs that bent at odd angles. Its face was a blur, as if the camera couldn't quite capture it. It stood there, motionless, staring directly into the camera. Jake couldn't breathe. The figure turned and began to walk toward the camera, its movements jerky and unnatural. Jake's hands trembled as he reached for the walkie-talkie, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the screen. The figure reached the elevator doors, and they slid shut. The elevator began to descend. Jake's mind raced. What would he do when it reached the lobby? Was this a prank? A hallucination? His heart pounded in his chest as he waited, watching the floor indicator. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened. Nothing. The lobby was empty. Jake exhaled a shaky breath, feeling the tension drain from his body. He rubbed his eyes and laughed nervously. "I need sleep," he muttered, standing up to stretch. Then he noticed something on the monitor. The camera feed in the lobby showed the empty elevator, but the doors weren't closing. They stayed open, as if waiting. And then, slowly, the floor indicator began to rise again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Jake's blood ran cold. His phone buzzed, making him jump. It was a message from the building's maintenance man, Carl. "Hey, Jake. Heard you've been seeing weird stuff on the cameras. Stay away from the 6th floor. Whatever you do, don't go there." Jake stared at the message, feeling the weight of dread settle in his stomach. He glanced back at the screen. The figure was still there, its hand still pointing. And then, slowly, it turned and began walking down the hallway. Without thinking, Jake grabbed his flashlight and headed for the elevator. He didn't know what was driving him, curiosity, fear, or something darker, but he had to know. The elevator doors slid open. Jake hesitated for just a moment before stepping inside. He pressed the button for the 5th floor, but the elevator ignored him. It began to rise, passing the floors one by one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The doors opened to a hallway that shouldn't exist. The air was thick, damp, and smelled of decay. The walls were peeling, and the lights flickered erratically. Jake's flashlight shook in his hand as he stepped out of the elevator. The hallway stretched before him, impossibly long. At the far end, he saw the figure standing, its back turned to him. Jake took a step forward, then another. He could hear his own breathing, ragged and shallow, echoing through the empty space. The figure didn't move, but Jake could feel its presence, cold and malevolent. He took one more step, and then it turned around. Its face, if it could be called that, was a twisted mass of shadows and darkness, with no features, just an empty void. Jake stumbled backward, his flashlight flickering. The figure began to glide toward him, its movements smooth and unnatural. Jake turned and ran. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly before him, no matter how fast he ran. His breaths came in short gasps, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. He reached the elevator, slammed his hand against the button, and the doors miraculously opened. He stumbled inside and pressed the lobby button repeatedly. The doors closed just as the figure reached the elevator. Jake squeezed his eyes shut, praying for the elevator to move. And it did. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the elevator descended. Jake didn't open his eyes until he felt the familiar jolt of the elevator stopping at the lobby. When the doors opened, Jake bolted out, running past the front desk and out the building's front doors. He didn't stop running until he was far away from Parkview Apartments that he never returned to work, never answered the calls from his boss, and never told anyone about what he had seen. But every night, as he lay in bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was